Hello and welcome back. I am glad you are here tonight. It is 7 in the morning in a house on a quiet street in Kensington, and Mary is already awake. She's been awake since 6. She's 28 years old, she was born in Yorkshire, and for the past 14 months she's lived in this house, on the 3rd floor, in a room she did not choose. The room faces north. The window is set high in the wall, the way school windows are, so that the children cannot look out during lessons. The fire has not been lit. It is the housemaid's job to light the schoolroom fire, and the housemaid has not come yet, so the room is cold, and will stay cold until somebody remembers it. Mary is setting out the morning materials. She places the slates in a row. She sets down the chalk tray, and the chalk rattles faintly against the tin. She lifts the globe onto its stand, a 12-inch sphere on a brass axis, and she spins it once, absently, to check that it turns. It makes a soft grinding sound, and then it is still. On the desk behind her, a tallow candle is still burning, because the morning light through a north-facing window is not enough to read by. The candle smells faintly of mutton. It has been burning since she rose, and by now the wick needs trimming. From somewhere below, faintly, comes the sound of a piano, one of the children practicing scales before breakfast as the governess requires. On the corner of her desk there is a tray. It was brought up an hour ago. There is tea on it, and bread, and nothing else. There is nothing on the tray that would tell you, looking at it, whether the woman who received it is the teacher of this household's children, or its most isolated inhabitant. Most of us, if we picture a Victorian governess at all, imagine a respected figure, an educated woman, trusted by the family, welcome at their table, admired for her learning. The reality was something far more structurally peculiar. A professional advice manual published in 1844 described the governess's life in 2 words, as solitary confinement. Another, from 1840, warned young women entering the profession to expect, and these are the author's own words, a seclusion from society altogether. If these quiet histories are the kind of thing that makes your evening a little slower, a subscribe would mean a great deal to me. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the hour is there. I always read them, so dim whatever light is still on. Let your shoulders come down. We're going back to a cold morning in a London schoolroom, and we will take it slowly. The woman in the schoolroom did not choose to be there. Almost none of them did. That is the first thing to understand about the Victorian governess, and it changes everything that follows. The word governess, by the middle of the 19th century, had come to mean something very specific. It meant a woman who had once expected a different life, a woman whose father had been a clergyman, or a surgeon, or a military officer, or a man with a small business that had seemed, for a time, solid. And then something had happened. A bankruptcy. A death. A speculation that turned in a season when several things turned at once. The daughter of that household woke one morning into a world that looked the same but had changed underneath, and the question she faced was not what she wanted to do. It was what she was permitted to do. The law itself was the first wall. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed the property rights of women throughout most of the Victorian period, a woman did not own her own money. Her father controlled it. When she married, her husband controlled it. She was not, in the eyes of the law, a separate financial person. So when a father went bankrupt or died without adequate provision, his daughter was left with nothing. Not reduced circumstances, nothing. No inheritance she could access, no trade she'd been trained for, no profession she was permitted to enter. The phrase used at the time, and it appeared in social commentary in charitable minutes, in the private letters of women who had lived it, was blunt. A woman in this position had three options. She could marry, she could become a governess, or she could starve. Those were the words: governess, marriage, or starvation. The women who arrived at this crossroads came from everywhere, from Yorkshire and Kent and the parishes outside Dublin, from towns where their fathers had been known, where they had attended church in good clothes, where their names had appeared in the subscription lists of local charities. Agnes, Ellen, Mary, Sarah, Harriet, Charlotte, Frances, Jane. They had not been poor. They had been the daughters of the kind of men who gave to the poor, and now, in the space of a single financial collapse, they were looking for a room in someone else's house, in a city where nobody knew them. The cruelty of the arrangement was that the qualities that made a woman suitable for the role were the same qualities that made her vulnerable to it. She had been educated. She could play the piano, speak French, sketch a landscape in watercolour. She had been raised to be accomplished, because accomplished daughters married well. And when the money vanished and the marriage did not come, those accomplishments became her only currency. And the only buyer was a household that needed someone to teach its children the same things. It is a remarkable economy. The system that trained her to be decorative was the same system that, when it failed, sold the decoration back at a discount. And there were a great many of them. That is the part that shifts this from a personal misfortune into a structural condition. The 1851 census, the first to measure the population of England and Wales with real demographic precision, recorded a fact that alarmed the country. There were more than 1 million unmarried women over the age of 25. 500,000 more women than men in the total population. 1 million is not a footnote. It is not a pocket of hardship in a northern industrial town. It is 1 million women in a country of 20 million people for whom the only socially approved route to financial security, marriage, was statistically unlikely to arrive. The scale of the problem was visible enough that it generated its own public rituals. By 1843, a charity called the Governesses Benevolent Institution had been founded in London, and its annual festival was attended by some of the most prominent voices of the day. Charles Dickens spoke at the first of them. It was not a small private gathering. It was a public event at which the condition of educated, impoverished women was discussed openly as a crisis. A pamphleteer named William Rathbone Gregg published his response in 1862. He called it, "Why Are Women Redundant?" The title is the argument. In Gregg's view, 500,000 women who could not find husbands were not unfortunate. They were surplus, redundant, the way a factory produces goods it cannot sell. He proposed, among other remedies, that they be shipped to the colonies, where the ratio of men to women was more favourable, which is one way to address a social problem. It was not the way the women themselves would have phrased it. The full picture was even wider than the headline figure suggested. Gregg had focused on the surplus of women over men, but the census told a broader and more disquieting story. The total number of unmarried women in Britain was approximately 2.5 million. Demographers of the period estimated that roughly 30% of women alive at mid-century would never marry at all, not because they chose not to, because the numbers made it impossible. 30% is not a margin. It is not an unlucky minority at the edge of a mostly functional system. It is nearly 1 woman in 3. In a church congregation of 60 women, 18 of them were, by the arithmetic of the age, unlikely ever to leave that church as a wife. For those who became governesses, the annual rhythm of the position carried its own particular tension. Her contract, if it could be called that, was typically renewed year to year by mutual and silent agreement. There was no written confirmation, no letter in November assuring her that the spring term was secure. She simply continued unless she was told otherwise, and she was never told at a convenient time. She might learn at Christmas that she would not be needed past Easter. She might learn in the spring that she would not be needed at all. The result was a labour market with a permanent oversupply of anxious, qualified, desperate candidates, and an employer class that had no reason to offer better terms. If one governess left or was dismissed or fell ill, another could be found within the week. The replacement would accept the same salary, the same isolation, the same silence at meals, because her alternative was the word Greg had used: redundancy. The governess was not an exception to the marriage market. She was its predictable outcome, and because there were so many, the families who hired them could afford to be extraordinarily particular about what they wanted. Newspaper advertisements for governess positions in the 1840s and 50s read less like job postings and more like specifications for a bespoke instrument: fluent French, competent German, proficiency in piano, drawing and watercolour, a thorough knowledge of English history and geography, unimpeachable moral character, Church of England preferred, age not above 30. The effect on wages was predictable. When supply exceeds demand by a sufficient margin, the buyer sets the price. Families did not need to offer competitive salaries, because the women applying had no competing offers and no alternative profession. The governess accepted what she was given, because the next woman in the queue would accept it if she did not. It is the kind of market that looks, from the outside, like a free exchange. From the inside, it is nothing of the kind. It took a clergyman to say it plainly. Not a politician, not a journalist, not one of the periodical writers who had begun to notice the governess as a subject for commentary. A clergyman in London who had seen enough of what happened to these women when the work stopped. In 1843, the Reverend David Laing founded the Governesses Benevolent Institution. The reason was simple, and it was damning. The profession offered no safety net of any kind, no pension, no provision for illness, no mechanism for retirement, no savings scheme, no insurance, no union, no guild, no professional body that might speak on their behalf. A woman who spent 20 years teaching the children of wealthy families could arrive at the age of 55 with nothing, not reduced savings, not a modest pension from a grateful employer, nothing. The family she had served were under no obligation to provide for her once her usefulness was exhausted, and most of them did not. The GBI's work began with the most urgent cases: women who had been dismissed after falling ill and had nowhere to sleep, women who had aged past the point of employment and had no family remaining to return to, women who had come from provincial towns and cathedral cities and small parishes across England, and had spent their entire working lives inside the houses of strangers, and were now, at the end of those lives, strangers themselves. The institution's annual meetings documented their cases in the minutes: names, ages, years of service, current condition. The condition was, with painful regularity, the same word: destitute. The charity founded to rescue governesses was, in practical terms, the only institution in the country that acknowledged they existed as a professional class. Which tells you something about how the rest of the country regarded the class. And yet the families who employed these women were not, for the most part, villains. They were not the cruel employers of a stage melodrama. They were ordinary middle-class households doing what ordinary middle-class households did, which was to maintain their position in the social order by the visible markers that the social order required. One of those markers was the employment of a governess. A family that hired a private governess for its daughters was announcing something specific to the street, to the parish, to the circle of acquaintance in which dinner invitations mattered. It was saying that it could afford private education, that its daughters would not be sent to a common school, that the household was managed with refinement. The governess was part of the furniture of respectability, alongside the Sunday carriage and the silver tea service. The children she taught had names that announced the same aspiration: Edith, Maud, Constance, Ethel, Evelyn, Alice. For the boys, Arthur, Frederick, George, Charles, Henry. Names drawn from the upper reaches of a world the family was climbing toward. The governess prepared the daughters for that world. She taught them to sit, to speak, to enter a room, to play a piece after dinner without embarrassment. She was training them for a life she herself would never be invited to share. The paradox is worth pausing on. The family hired the governess to demonstrate its respectability, and then, having hired her, treated her in a way that was not by any honest measure respectable. She was not invited to dinner. She was not introduced to visitors. She was by design invisible, because the point of employing her was not her presence. It was the fact that the family could afford her absence from the wider world. She was the proof of something she was not permitted to be part of. By the late 1840s, the situation had become visible enough to produce something that social commentary alone had not managed. It produced literature. The governess problem, as it was known in the periodicals and the correspondence columns, generated a substantial body of fiction in a remarkably compressed window of time. In 1847, Charlotte Brontë published Jane Eyre. In the same year, her younger sister Anne published Agnes Grey. Between 1847 and 1848, William Makepeace Thackeray published Vanity Fair in monthly instalments, and in 1848 Anne Brontë published The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. 4 major novels, 3 authors, 2 years, all of them centred on the figure of a governess, all of them written by people who had either lived the experience or observed it at close quarters. What the novels shared was not just their subject, but their anger. The anger was specific. It was not about poverty exactly, or about class exactly. It was about the particular cruelty of a position in which a woman had no legal entitlement to a single afternoon, no Sunday that was truly her own, no guaranteed rest in a working week that had no defined end, and no recourse if any of it was withdrawn. The novels gave that cruelty a voice, because the women living inside it were not permitted to raise theirs. A governess who complained was a governess who was replaced. The publishing window is worth noticing because of what it reveals about pressure. A single novel about a governess is a book. 4 novels in 2 years by unrelated authors working independently is a rupture. The subject had reached the point at which it could no longer be contained in private correspondence and charitable minutes. It had entered the public conversation, and it had done so through the one medium that could make a reader feel what a committee report could not. The story had found its writers. The writers had lived it. The institution that David Laing founded in 1843 did not close quickly. It did not serve its purpose for a decade and dissolve, the way a great many Victorian charities did, once the immediate crisis had passed and the subscriptions thinned. It continued. The Governesses Benevolent Institution operated continuously for 174 years. It transferred its remaining assets to the Teaching Staff Trust in 2017. That is not a misprint. 2017. The charity founded to rescue destitute governesses in the year that Dickens was writing. A Christmas Carol was still providing support to its beneficiaries in the year that most people carried a telephone in their pocket. 174 years is not a long administrative tale. It is an indication of how deep the damage went and how slowly the consequences faded from individual lives. The women the GBI supported in its final decades were not governesses themselves. They were the descendants and dependents of women whose working lives had produced no pension, no savings, and no provision, and whose poverty had moved forward through the generations like a current that nobody had thought to stop. The institution adapted as the profession disappeared. By the early 20th century, the classical Victorian governess was largely gone, replaced by schools and trained teachers, and a system that no longer depended on a single unqualified woman in a private house. But the need the GBI served had not vanished. It had changed shape. The women it helped were older, their files were thicker, their conditions were the long aftermath of a system that had employed them thoroughly and provided for them not at all. That a Victorian charity lasted into the age of the internet is, in a quiet way, one of the most damning facts about the profession it was created to serve. The system that had employed 25,000 women in 1851 was still producing consequences that required charitable intervention 166 years later. Some debts take a very long time to come due. The reason nobody found the arrangement surprising at the time is that the system, from the outside, looked voluntary. A woman applied for a position. A family offered it. Terms were agreed. The exchange appeared to anyone not standing inside it perfectly fair. What it actually was a market in which one side had no alternative and the other side knew it. And the physical evidence of everything that market produced was waiting every morning on a tray. The tray on Mary's desk arrived at 6, carried by a housemaid who left it without speaking. It carries her tea and her bread and nothing else, and it carries something more than breakfast, which is the answer to a question the householders never needed to ask aloud. Where exactly does the governess eat? She eats here, in the schoolroom, at the same desk where she marks the children's exercise books, beside the same globe she spun this morning while the house was still waking. The tray is the answer, and the answer is the room. To understand what this life actually felt like, it is not enough to know the forces that put her here. It is necessary to stand in the room, to see its dimensions, to feel its temperature, to know where the light falls and where it does not. Her day begins in the attic, not the schoolroom, the attic. The governess's bedroom was typically the highest room in the house, tucked under the eaves on the uppermost floor, a small space with thin walls and a bare wooden floor, or sometimes a small rug that did not reach the edges. The ceiling sloped with the roof line. In summer the air was trapped under the tiles and the room was stifling. In winter it was the coldest room in the house, because heat rises, but not that far, and because the attic, in most households, had no fireplace at all. The room contained a bed, a chest of drawers, and a wash basin, sometimes less. One historical account described it as a tangible sign of the employer's indifference. Not cruelty, exactly. Indifference. The room was functional. It held what a room needed to hold. It was simply never given a moment's thought beyond that. In January, the wash basin water was cold enough to make the hands ache. She washed her face in it, dressed in it, pinned her hair in it, in the dark or by a single candle, before anyone else in the household was awake. The room was not where she lived. It was where she slept, and where she stored her trunk, and where, in the hour between the children's bedtime and her own, she wrote her letters by the light of a candle that smelled faintly of mutton fat. It was private in the sense that nobody else entered it. It was not private in any other sense at all. It was, in every meaningful way, someone else's room that she was permitted to occupy. From the attic she came down to the schoolroom. This was the journey she made every morning, in the dark or the half-dark, before the children were awake. The governess's working day typically began between 5:30 and 6:30. She rose before the household to prepare the day's lessons, to set out the materials, to review the previous day's work. Morning piano practice, which the children were required to complete before breakfast, began at 7 or shortly after, and she supervised it from the schoolroom or from the corridor outside the music room, listening for missed notes and repeated bars. Formal lessons ran from 9 until noon. The afternoon session ran from 2 until 5. Evening duties continued after that. Moral instruction and scripture reading and supervision of the children's supper and bedtime until the children were in bed, which in a well-ordered household might be 8 or 9 o'clock at night. That is approximately 15 hours. 15 hours in which she was either teaching, supervising, or available to teach and supervise, with no guaranteed interval in between that was unambiguously her own. The school day's beginning had its own particular sound. A quiet knock at the schoolroom door, which was the housemaid with the breakfast tray. Then a pause. Then, from somewhere along the corridor or from the floor below, the sound of children's feet on the stairs, small and hurried. The governess had already been up for an hour. She had already set out the slates in a row, checked the chalk, opened the grammar book to the correct page. And now, from the piano downstairs came the sound of scales, halting and repeated, the same 4 bars played again, because the children had been told to practice before breakfast, and the governess would know from the sound whether they had done it properly or merely gone through the motions. The day had no fixed hour of ending. That is the phrase that recurs in every account of the profession. No fixed hour. She was on duty from the moment the children woke until the moment they were in bed, and every activity between those points, including the afternoon walk, including the meals she ate at her desk, was supervised time. Not free time. Time that belonged to someone else. She did not clock in, and she did not clock out. The clock ran without stopping. She was not the only person in the house who worked long hours. The housemaid started earlier. They were at work by 5 in the morning, lighting fires, cleaning grates, emptying chamber pots, and making every room presentable before the family came downstairs. In households without a dedicated nursemaid, the governess herself might need to be present from the moment the children first stirred, which could be before 6. Her morning began after the housemaid's but before the family's, in a gap of the household timetable that belonged to neither the world upstairs nor the world below stairs. The difference between the housemaid's hours and the governess's was not the number, but the nature. The housemaid's work was physical, visible, and defined. She had a list. The last item on it had a time attached. When the list was finished, her day was done. The governess's work was intellectual, invisible, and open-ended. Her list had no last item because her presence was itself a duty, and presence does not have a finishing time. And the housemaid, for all the weight of her labour, had one thing the governess did not. She belonged somewhere. She had the servants' hall, the kitchen table, the company of the other servants at meals, the shared grumbling and the shared tea. The governess had the schoolroom and the schoolroom fire when it was lit. It was the housemaid's job to lay and light the schoolroom fire, a small coal fire in a moderate grate. If the housemaid forgot or was too busy with the rooms the family used first, or simply had not reached the third floor yet. The governess sat in the cold and waited. She could not ring for it, because ringing the bell was the family's prerogative, and she was not family. She could not go downstairs and ask the servants directly, because doing so placed her in the uncomfortable position of giving orders to people who did not consider her their superior, and who, in many households, resented her presence in the house altogether. So she waited. She sat in the cold room with the slates and the chalk and the unlit grate, and she waited for someone to remember that the schoolroom existed. The fire came eventually. The cold came first. When the fire was lit and the children arrived, the work itself was formidable. A governess was expected to teach the full range of subjects considered necessary for the education of middle-class daughters, and the range was extraordinary. Reading, writing, arithmetic, English history, geography, French, and sometimes Italian and sometimes German, piano, drawing, painting in watercolour, needlework, and deportment, which meant posture and manners and the correct way to enter a room, the correct way to address a visitor, the correct way to sit at a table that she herself would never be invited to join. She held no professional qualification in any of them. There was no certificate, no diploma, no examining body, no standard that distinguished a woman who could teach French grammar from a woman who merely spoke it badly. The only credential she possessed was the opinion of the mother who employed her, and that opinion could change at any time, for any reason, and was not subject to appeal. The schoolroom held the tools of this work: a blackboard, propped on a stand or leaning against the wall, a row of desks smaller than an adult would use, iron-framed and scaled for children, slates and chalk, a globe, a pianoforte, usually an upright, positioned against the far wall where it would not obstruct the lesson. The windows were set high in the wall, the way they were in formal schools, designed to admit light from above while preventing the children from staring out at the street. The effect was distinctive. Natural light fell from a steep angle, illuminating the centre of the room and leaving the lower walls and corners in permanent shadow, even at midday. The governess, seated at her desk near the side wall, often worked in dimmer light than the children she was teaching. She taught all of this, 12 subjects in a room lit from above, to children who had not chosen to be there any more than she had, for approximately 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, with no formal training, no performance review beyond a mother's passing comment, and no mechanism for professional advancement except the single reference letter her employer might choose to provide when she left. It is a curriculum that would, in a modern school, require a department. She delivered it alone. The break in the middle of the day was not a break. It was a different kind of work conducted outdoors. The governess was expected to supervise the children's afternoon walk, which lasted 1 to 2 hours regardless of weather. The walk was not leisure. It was treated as an extension of the classroom, during which the governess was expected to teach deportment, observation of nature, and the social manners appropriate to being seen on a public street. The children were to walk correctly, greet acquaintances properly, and conduct themselves as though they were always being watched, because in the streets where these families lived, they generally were. The afternoon walk was the only time the governess regularly left the house, the only time she passed through a front door, walked on a pavement, felt the weather directly on her face rather than through glass. And even then, she was not walking for herself. She was walking for the children, and the walk was a performance of the same respectability the family had hired her to maintain. In winter, she walked in wool. In rain, she walked in wool that grew heavier as it soaked, and that would take most of the evening to dry, filling the schoolroom with the faint damp smell of a wet dress slowly giving up its water. The children complained of the cold. The governess did not. She walked at the pace the youngest child could manage, stopped when the children stopped, corrected them when they strayed, and returned to the house with the same number of children she had left with, which was the only standard by which the walk's success was measured. When the walk was finished, she returned to the schoolroom, to the slates, to the piano, to the afternoon session that ran until 5, and after 5, to the evening duties, the scripture and the moral instruction and the supervision of supper and bedtime that carried the day to its conclusion without a visible seam. The door she passed through to reach the street was the same door she passed through to come back. The house absorbed her again every afternoon at the same hour, and 3 times a day the tray. The governess ate her meals alone in the schoolroom, excluded from the family's dining room because she was an employee, and excluded from the servants' kitchen because she was a gentlewoman. Her position made her uncomfortable at both tables, and so a third arrangement was made which was no table at all. A tray, carried up by a housemaid, set down on the desk where the exercise books had been pushed aside, and left without conversation. The food was plain, similar to the nursery diet or the servants' portion, or something between the two. Roast or boiled meat, bread, a simple pudding, not the family's dinner, which was served 2 floors below, with wine and talk and silverware. The governess ate at a desk that still smelled of chalk dust and iron, gall ink, in a room where the fire was burning down, and below her the family talked, and above her the attic waited, and the day continued. 3 meals a day, 365 days a year, for years. The tray came up, the tray went down, nothing else changed. The household that employed her kept careful accounts, and the accounts reveal something that the dining arrangement only implies. A family earning £300 per year, squarely lower middle class but respectable, allocated its income according to published budgeting guides. £150 went to housekeeping, which covered provisions, coal, gas, laundry and servants' wages. £40 went to rent, 35 to clothing, 20 to education. The governess's salary, which was typically around £40 per year, was included in the housekeeping line. Not the education line, although she was the sole provider of the children's education. Not a separate professional fee. Housekeeping. The same column as the coal and the candles and the laundry soap. The connection was not only administrative, it was physical. On a cold January morning, the schoolroom fire was supplied from the same coal budget that paid for her, and it was supplied last. The family's drawing room received its fire first, the bedrooms next, the nursery, the kitchen range was always burning. The schoolroom on the 3rd floor was reached when there was time, which meant after everything else. The near end of the room, closest to the grate, might be tolerable once the fire had caught. The far end, where the governess often sat, was cold enough to see breath. She moved through both temperatures as the lesson demanded, and the budget that paid for the coal that heated the warm end of her room was the same budget that paid for her. She was, in the household's accounting, a running cost, not an investment, not a professional engagement, a cost listed in the same column as the things that kept the house warm and lit and clean. She was budgeted alongside the coal, and in more ways than one she was treated like it. The long-term cost of this arrangement was not visible in any household ledger. It was visible in other records entirely. Contemporary social observers, and later historians working from institutional archives, found that former governesses appeared disproportionately in the admission records of Victorian lunatic asylums. The social commentator Harriet Martineau writing at mid-century, described the profession in 2 words that have remained in the historical literature ever since. She called it lonely and neurosis breeding. Lonely is self-evident. The years of eating alone, the excluded table, the adult conversation reduced to the margins of someone else's schedule. But neurosis breeding is the word that stops you. It is not describing an unfortunate side effect. It is describing a mechanism. The profession did not merely attract women who were already vulnerable. It produced the vulnerability, the isolation, the precarity, the absence of any human relationship that was not conditional on employment. These were not incidental features of the role. They were the role. The woman sitting at the schoolroom desk at 7 in the morning, setting out the chalk, waiting for the fire and the children and the long day that will not release her until 9 at night. That woman is not simply working hard. She is inside a structure that removes from her life, systematically and by design, every element that might sustain her. Friendship, autonomy, rest, status, a future she can see the shape of. She has none of these, not because they were taken from her by a single act of cruelty, but because the position was built on their absence. The system that was designed to protect the children's development was, over time, destroying the mind of the woman hired to deliver it. The asylum records are not anomalies, they are consequences, and the distance between the schoolroom and the asylum was measured not in miles but in years. Some rooms are harder to leave than they appear. The room on the 3rd floor is the centre of this story, and everything that happens in it radiates outward from the same 4 walls. The fire, when it comes, the tray 3 times a day, the high window that lets in the light, but not the view, the slates in their row, the smell of chalk and tallow, and in the middle of it all, the globe on its brass stand, which Mary spun once this morning before the children arrived. It turned slowly, Africa giving way to the Atlantic, and then it was still. The globe is always there, and what it represents, the world outside this room, is the one subject she teaches that she will never be permitted to reach. But before the world outside there is the work inside, the daily, hourly, unresting work, and that work has rules that were never written down in any contract, because no contract existed, and because no one had ever thought it necessary to ask what, precisely, a governess was required to do. The globe is geography. Geography is one of 12 subjects, and the woman who teaches it has never been trained to teach anything at all. This is the part that does not survive into the popular image. The governess is remembered as educated, accomplished, refined. All of those things may have been true. What was not true in any professional sense was that she was qualified. There was no training institution for governesses until 1848, when Queen's College was founded in London, and even then the college offered lectures and examinations, not a recognised professional certificate. There was no examining body before that. No professional journal, no register of competence, no pathway that led from a woman who could play the piano to a woman who could teach a child to play the piano. The two were assumed to be the same skill. They are not, and the difference between them is the difference between knowledge and pedagogy requires training that nobody thought to provide. A cook could apprentice, a surgeon could study and sit an examination. A schoolmaster at a boys' grammar school had, in most cases, attended a university and taken a degree in the subject he taught. The governess had done none of these things. She had been raised in a household that valued accomplishment, and when her circumstances collapsed, she offered those accomplishments to the market as professional skills. The market accepted them without question, because it had no means of questioning them and no interest in developing one. The mechanics of that conversion are worth understanding, because they explain a great deal about why the work was so exhausting and so poorly compensated. What she had learned as a pupil. She'd been taught French by a tutor, or by a governess of her own, or by a mother who spoke it well enough to pass it on. She had been taught piano by a visiting music master who came once a week. She'd been taught drawing, needlework, history and geography from textbooks chosen by someone else, in a comfortable room, with no expectation that she would one day stand on the other side of the same desk and deliver the same material to a child who did not want to learn it. Now she was expected to teach all of these things herself, to children she had not chosen, in a room she had not furnished, using materials that belonged to the household, and she had no pedagogical training to guide her. No understanding of how a child acquires the ability to read, as opposed to how an adult remembers having learned. No method for teaching arithmetic to a girl who could not grasp long division, beyond repeating the explanation more slowly, and hoping that repetition would succeed where comprehension had not. No system for managing a room in which 3 children of different ages were studying 3 different subjects at the same time, which is what the schoolroom frequently required, because sisters were taught together regardless of the gap between them. She taught what she knew, in the way she had been taught it. If the method worked, the children progressed. If it did not, the failure was hers. The remedy was simple. She was replaced by the next woman in the queue, who would teach the same subjects, in the same way, with the same absence of training, and who would, in time, encounter the same difficulties and be replaced in turn. It is a system that treats competence as a natural property of class. If a woman was raised well, the assumption went she could transmit that raising to others. The assumption was convenient for the families who relied on it. It was also, in a significant number of cases, demonstrably wrong. The daily evidence of this work accumulated in objects that nobody but the governess would notice. The schoolroom table, by afternoon, told the story of the morning. Chalk dust on the surface, fine and white, settling into the grain of the wood and remaining there until the housemaid wiped it the following day. Chalk dust on the governess's sleeves, on the dark wool of her dress, visible against the fabric in a pale stripe, where her forearm had rested against the blackboard while she wrote the day's vocabulary list or the morning's arithmetic problems. The dominant sound of the morning lesson was not her voice. It was the scratch of chalk on slate, a dry, insistent scraping that filled the room the way a clock fills a quiet room, not loudly but constantly, repeated dozens of times per hour as the children copied their exercises, and the governess walked between the desks, stopping to correct a letter here, a sum there, her own chalk in her hand, adding her marks to the children's work. By the end of the morning, the air in the room had a particular quality. Chalk dust hung in it, visible in the column of light from the high window, and the iron gall ink that the older pupils used for their compositions added a faint metallic edge to the smell. The ink was mixed from powder, a dark blue-black liquid that the governess prepared herself, and it stained her fingertips and the edges of the pages and dried slowly in the cold room, taking longer than it would have in a warmer one. The written work moved through a cycle. The younger children wrote on slates during the morning and wiped them clean for the afternoon, but the older daughters produced their work in exercise books with marbled covers, bound in a pattern of blue and brown that was standard to most stationers of the period. The governess marked these in red ink, and the marks accumulated page after page in a record that nobody but the governess would ever study closely. She knew each child's handwriting as well as she knew her own, and she marked accordingly in notes that were thorough and patient and written for an audience that was, most of the time, absent. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, and the house had settled into the quieter rhythms of the adults' dinner below, she wrote the lesson reports. These were detailed summaries of the day's instruction, the progress of each child in each subject, the passages covered, the difficulties encountered, the areas requiring further attention. She wrote them at the schoolroom desk, by the light of a tallow candle, or a small oil lamp held close to the page, in her own time, which is to say in time that was not paid for, because her salary covered her presence in the house, not the hours she worked inside it, and her presence was assumed to be continuous. The reports went to the mother of the household. Sometimes they were read carefully and annotated. More often they were glanced at and placed in a drawer and not consulted again until the following term, when the mother might ask how the eldest daughter's French was progressing, and the governess would explain what the reports had already explained, weeks earlier, to an empty drawer. The father rarely saw them. The governess wrote them regardless, because the writing of them was expected, and the failure to produce them was noticed even when the reading of them was not. The schoolroom tools were few and specific. The globe, which she used for geography, and which the children were permitted to spin only when she said so. A Bible for scripture and moral instruction, its spine cracked and its margins clean. A grammar book for passing and composition, its pages marked with slips of paper at the lessons she intended to teach that week. These three objects sat on the desk or on the shelf behind it every day, year after year, in every governess's schoolroom, as constant as the furniture itself. They were the instruments of a curriculum that had not changed substantially in 30 years, and they would not change until the profession itself had been swept away by something larger. The piano occupied a category of its own. It was the most important of the governess's responsibilities, and the most time-consuming, because it was the accomplishment most publicly displayed. When guests came to dinner, the eldest daughter might be asked to play. When a potential suitor paid a call, the daughter's musical ability was assessed alongside her face, her manner, and her father's income. The piano was the shop window of the governess's work, and the shop window had to gleam. This meant practice, 1 to 2 hours every day, beyond the time allocated to formal lessons. The governess supervised it, listening from the far side of the room or from the corridor outside, correcting fingering, correcting tempo, correcting the angle of the wrist, correcting posture. The sound of scales, halting and uneven, rising from the schoolroom and drifting through the upper floors of the house, was as much a part of the household's daily texture as the clatter of pans from the kitchen or the sound of carriage wheels from the street. The governess heard it for years, the same scales, the same C major, the same stumble at the fourth bar, the same patient correction delivered in the same measured voice, morning after morning, month after month, until the child could play the piece without error. And then a new piece was set, and the whole careful process started again from the beginning. The patience required for this was not a small thing. It was the central professional skill of the governess, more important than her French, more demanding than her geography, more tested than anything else in her working day. But it was not acknowledged as a skill. It was assumed to be a temperament, a natural quality of womanhood, the same way nurturing and gentleness were assumed to be natural, and therefore not worth paying for, and the temperament was policed. The governess was expected to model moral character at all times, not as an aspiration but as a binding condition of her employment. She was the moral exemplar for the daughters of the household, and any perceived lapse in her own conduct, real or imagined, could be treated as grounds for immediate dismissal. A letter from a correspondent the mother did not recognise, a conversation overheard in a tone that was judged too familiar, a friendship with a male acquaintance, however innocent, a laugh that was too loud or too frequent or aimed at the wrong person in the wrong room at the wrong hour. The standard was not written down in any contract. It did not need to be. The governess understood from the first morning in the house that she was being observed, and that the observation was continuous, and that it was part of the arrangement. Her dress told her so. It was required to be dark, modest, and plain. High-necked wool in winter, high-necked cotton in summer, in colours that did not attract the eye. Not fashionable, because fashion would have drawn attention, and attention was precisely what her position was designed to prevent. Not the family's style, because she was not family. Not a servant's uniform, because she was not a servant either. Her clothing was a visual signal, legible to anyone who entered the house, that this woman occupied a position between the two worlds and belonged fully to neither. The chalk dust on her sleeves was, in this light, almost a mercy. It marked her as the teacher. Without it, a visitor entering the schoolroom might not have known what she was. She wore the dress. She modelled the character. She supervised the scales and marked the books and wrote the reports and taught the 12 subjects and walked the children through the rain and ate the meals that arrived on the tray. And for all of this she was paid. The amount varied. The lowest recorded salaries for a governess in the Victorian period were around £15 per year, which was offered to very young women in their first positions, or to older women whose bargaining power had eroded with their youth. The highest salaries, in wealthy aristocratic households with exacting requirements and large numbers of daughters, reached £100. But the vast majority fell between £20 and £45, and the most commonly cited figure in the advice literature, the figure that families budgeted for and governesses expected, was somewhere between £30 and £40 per year. Take £35, divide it by 52 weeks, that is 13 shillings and 6pence per week. Now divide that by 6 working days, that is 2 shillings and 3pence per day. Now divide that by the 15 hours she was on duty, from before 6 in the morning until 9 at night. The figure is less than 2pence per hour. A skilled needlewoman working piecework in a London garment workshop earned more than that. A washerwoman, paid by the day, earned more. The cook in the same household, who had no French and no geography and no watercolour and no piano and no deportment, earned more than the governess, and the cook received her meals at the kitchen table in company with conversation, and her room had a fire that was lit every morning without having to be asked for. The governess earned less than almost every other working woman in the house. The difference was that her poverty was invisible, because her accent and her dress and her posture and her vowels announced a class that had nothing to do with her income. She looked like a gentlewoman. She sounded like a gentlewoman. She was paid like a scullery maid, and she ate alone. It is a remarkable arrangement. The most educated woman in the building was also, in almost every measurable sense, the worst compensated person in it. And the reason was not complicated. Education was not what she was selling. Availability was. And availability in a market flooded with desperate, overqualified women was worth almost nothing at all. The one document that determined whether she could leave this house, and where she could go next, and whether the next household would open its door to her at all, was a single piece of paper. The reference letter. It was written by the employer in the employer's hand on the employer's notepaper. It described the governess's character, her teaching ability, her deportment, and her conduct during the period of her employment. It was addressed to no one in particular, and was intended for whoever thought to ask for it. Without this letter, she could not secure a new position. No respectable family would consider a governess who could not produce a reference from her previous employer. The absence of the letter said one thing, and it said it with a clarity that required no elaboration. Something had gone wrong. The letter was, in theory, a professional tool, a record of competence, a passport between households. In practice, it was something else entirely. It was the mechanism by which the employer controlled the governess's future, because the decision to write it, or to refuse to write it, or to delay it until the woman had nowhere else to turn, belonged entirely to the person she had served. A governess who left on good terms received her letter, and the letter opened the next door and the system continued. A governess who was dismissed for incompetence received nothing, and the nothing was, in its way, fair. But a governess who was dismissed for other reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with her teaching, also received nothing. And this is where the document becomes something much darker than a professional convenience. If the father of the household, or a grown son, or a male guest, made advances toward the governess, she was placed in a position from which no good outcome was available. If she refused and reported it, she risked being dismissed for causing trouble. If she refused and said nothing, the behaviour continued. If she was dismissed, for whatever reason the household chose to name, the reference letter could be withheld, and without the letter, no new position, no income, no room, and no way forward. The woman was most vulnerable precisely at the moment she had been wronged, and the document that was supposed to record her professional standing was the instrument of that vulnerability, held in the hand of the very person she could not afford to displease. The reference letter was not a professional safeguard. It was a leash, and the hand that held it was never hers. The work is the room, and the room is the work, and the reference letter is the door that leads out of both. But the door does not open from the inside. It opens at the discretion of the family that employed her, and what that family thought of her, what they said about her at their dinner table, what they told their friends and their neighbours and the visiting mothers who came to inspect the schoolroom, that is the next layer of this story. Because the governess's position in the household was not simply economic or professional or architectural, it was social, and the social arrangement was stranger and crueler than anything the salary or the daily schedule can explain. The reference letter mattered so much because the employer's opinion was the only opinion that existed. There was no professional register, no external review, no second voice. The governess's standing in the world depended entirely on what one family said about her, and what that family said depended on something that had very little to do with her teaching. It depended on where they placed her socially inside their own house. And the place they chose for her was, by any honest description, nowhere. The assumption most people carry about the Victorian governess, if they think of her at all, is that she was a respected member of the household, educated, trusted, something between a teacher and a maiden aunt, invited to the family's table, consulted on the children's progress, included in the rhythms of the house with a warmth that reflected her genteel origins and her daily closeness to the children she raised. The assumption is wrong. It is wrong in almost every particular, and what replaces it is more interesting and more damning than simple neglect. The governess occupied a position that historians have come to describe with a specific term, status incongruence. It means that her social origin and her economic position were in direct contradiction. She had been born into the gentry, or the professional classes, or the lower reaches of gentility. She spoke like the family. She dressed like the family. She'd been educated in the same manner as the family's own daughters, at the same piano from the same French grammar, and she was employed by the family, which made her, in the eyes of the household social architecture, not one of them. The contradiction was visible in every room she entered. When she sat in the schoolroom with the children, she was the teacher, and the children obeyed her, and the room made sense. When the mother entered the schoolroom to observe a lesson, the governess became an employee being reviewed, and the room shifted. When a guest visited the house and was shown the schoolroom, the governess was introduced as though she were part of the furniture, a feature of the household's respectability rather than a person with her own history and her own name. The same woman, in the same room, occupying 3 different positions in the space of an afternoon. She was not a servant. The servants knew this. She was not family. The family knew this. She existed in a space between the two, and the space had no name, no customs, no established rules for how a person standing inside it should be treated. The result was not cruelty exactly. It was something quieter and more corrosive. It was the daily experience of being present in a house full of people and belonging to none of them. Sir George Stephen, a barrister and social commentator, described the governess's position in 1844. He used 2 words, solitary confinement. He did not mean it as a metaphor. He meant it as a description of something he had observed in household after household, a pattern so consistent that it could not be attributed to the failings of individual employers. The governess lived in the house. She slept in the house. She ate in the house. She spent more hours in the children's company than the children's own mother did, and she was, in every social sense that the Victorian household recognised, alone. The solitary confinement was not an accident of circumstance or personality. It was structural. The house was divided into 2 social worlds, the family above and the servants below, and each world had its own geography, its own table, its own rituals of companionship. The governess was admitted to neither. She could not dine with the family because she was paid. She could not dine with the servants because she was a gentlewoman. The dining table was the centre of social life in a Victorian household, the place where conversation happened, where alliances were formed, where a person was acknowledged as present and real, and the governess was excluded from both of them. The physical arrangement of the house enforced the exclusion with an efficiency that no written rule could have matched. The family's rooms were on the 1st and 2nd floors, where the ceilings were high and the windows were wide, and the furniture had been chosen to impress. The servants' domain was below stairs, the kitchen and the scullery and the servants' hall, where the air was warmer and the company was reliable, and the work, for all its weight, was shared. The governess lived on the 3rd floor between the 2, in a room that was too high for the family and too genteel for the servants, and the staircase that connected the 3 worlds was, for her, a corridor. She descended each morning and climbed each night without stopping at either of the tables she passed. The drawing-room told the same story in miniature. On evenings when the family received guests, the drawing-room filled with light and voices and the particular smell of beeswax candles burning steadily in a warm room, and the scent of good furniture and cologne water and the faint sweetness of sherry or port carried on the air. The governess was upstairs. She could hear it. From the schoolroom on the 3rd floor, the sound of the family's laughter drifted up through the floorboards and the stairwell, muffled but unmistakable, and she sat in a room that smelled of chalk dust and tallow and the fading residue of the coal fire, and she was not invited down. She was not forbidden. That is important. Nobody locked a door. Nobody issued an instruction. She was simply not asked, and the not asking was so consistent, so universal, and so thoroughly understood by every person in the house that it carried the force of a rule without ever needing to be spoken as one. Susan Ridow, who published one of the most widely read advice manuals for governesses in 1840, was blunter than Stephen. She warned any young woman entering the profession to expect what she called a seclusion from society altogether. The word altogether is the one that matters, not a partial withdrawal, not a temporary reduction, a seclusion from society altogether, and the advice was not offered as a warning against a particularly harsh employer. It was offered as a description of the normal condition of the profession, the condition a prudent young woman should prepare for if she wished to survive it. The seclusion was total. The governess had no social life of her own. No invitations arrived for her at the house. No visitors called. No evening company was arranged in which she might have been included as a guest rather than an attendant. She was not invited to parish gatherings, although she attended the same parish church as the family. She was not introduced to the family's friends, although she lived in the same house and might pass them on the staircase. She was not mentioned in the conversation at dinner, although the children she taught were discussed constantly. She was, in the social life of the household, a person who did not exist. The letters she wrote, in the hour between the children's bedtime and her own, were the only sustained adult conversation available to her. She wrote them on notepaper she purchased from her own salary, by candlelight she paid for, in a room that belonged to someone else. The letters went out. Some came back. The correspondence was the thread that connected her to the life she had lived before, and it grew thinner with each year, because the people she'd known were moving forward, marrying, changing addresses, forgetting, and she was standing still in a room on the 3rd floor, writing by a candle that smelled of mutton fat. Her Sundays were technically free. In practice, they were the emptiest day of the week. She could attend church, and she did, sitting in a pew that was neither the family's nor the servants'. She could walk, if the weather allowed it. But she had no friends in the neighbourhood, because the neighbourhood had never been introduced to her. The family did not bring her forward. The servants did not invite her along. The shops she might have visited required money she could not afford to spend. The result was that her single day of liberty was, in most recorded accounts, her loneliest, because on Sundays the absence of companionship was not padded by the presence of work. The servants were not sympathetic. This is the detail that surprises people who expect solidarity between those who are employed by the same household. The servants' hall was its own world, with its own hierarchy, its own customs, its own fierce protections. The butler presided at the head of the kitchen table. The cook held dominion over her range. The housemaids, the footmen, the coachman, the boot boy, all of them had a defined place, a known function, a chair at the table, and a clear understanding of where they stood in relation to everyone else in the house. The governess threatened that order. She was not one of them. She did not eat with them. She did not share their workload. She did not join their conversations in the kitchen at night, when the fire was banked and the day's work was done, and the talk turned to the family's habits, and the housekeeper's moods, and the small dramas that made the long days bearable. And yet she lived in the same house, on a floor above them, in a room supplied by the same coal and cleaned by the same hands. She gave no orders to the servants. but her presence implied a claim to gentility that the servants had not given and didn't recognise, and the implication was enough to generate a cool, persistent resentment that never broke into open confrontation and never warmed into anything resembling friendship. The housemaid who carried the tray to the schoolroom 3 times a day was performing a duty, not an act of fellowship. The tray arrived. The tray departed. The words exchanged were few and functional and maintained at the precise temperature of professional distance. The housemaid did not linger. The governess did not ask her to, and the family, for its part, regarded the governess with something that was not unkindness, but was not kindness either. She was a necessary expense. Her presence in the house was a marker of the family's standing, as we have seen, and the education she delivered was genuinely valued, particularly when the eldest daughter played well at dinner or impressed a visitor with her French. But the governess's presence at the table itself, or in the drawing-room, or at a social evening, would have created an awkwardness that nobody in the household wished to manage. She was too educated to be dismissed and too employed to be embraced. The solution arrived at by every household independently, and yet with a uniformity that speaks to something deeper than individual preference, was to make her invisible. She ate in the schoolroom. She spent her evenings in the schoolroom. She withdrew to her attic bedroom at the same hour the family withdrew to theirs, but she withdrew from a room in which she had been alone, not from a room in which she had been in company. The family's evening ended in conversation and warmth. The governess's evening ended in silence, in a room where the fire had gone out, and she climbed the stairs to the attic with a candle in her hand and the sound of the house settling around her. The tray is worth returning to now because it has something more to say. In the opening, the tray appeared as a simple object, tea and bread and nothing else. In the schoolroom, it appeared again as the daily evidence of her exclusion. But the tray carries a detail that reveals the full architecture of her social position, and the detail is in the crockery itself. The family ate from china, a matched set, purchased for the household, carried to the dining room on a silver tray by a footman or a parlour maid. The china was washed in the scullery with particular care, because it was expensive and breakable, and would be difficult to replace if a piece were lost. It was the visual language of the family's standing, as legible as the drawing-room curtains or the front door's brass knocker. The servants ate from earthenware, heavy, durable, practical plates and bowls that could survive the kitchen table, the sink, and the rough end of a long day without anyone worrying about the cost. The earthenware was honest. It announced exactly what it was, and it lasted. The governess's tray carried neither. The crockery on her tray was unmatched. A cup from one set, a plate from another, a saucer that belonged to neither the family's service nor the servants' kitchen, but had been pulled from a cupboard somewhere in between, a piece of surplus crockery that fitted no category, and so had been assigned to the one person in the house who fitted no category either. Not the family's china, not the servants' earthenware. Unmatched. From neither set. It is a small thing to notice. A cup, a saucer, a plate that does not match the cup, and it is the thing that tells you everything. The crockery is the household speaking honestly about where the governess stands in a language it does not know it is using. The family chose the china for themselves. The housekeeper chose the earthenware for the kitchen. Nobody chose the governess's crockery at all. It simply arrived, assembled from the margins of two worlds that had each decided, independently and without consultation, that she did not belong to them. The meals themselves were determined by the children's schedule, not by hers, and not by the family's dinner hour. She ate when the children ate. which meant she ate early and plainly, and at times that had no relation to the rhythms of the adult household. The family sat down to dinner at 7 or 8 in the evening, long after the governess had already eaten, alone, 2 floors above, in a room where the fire was dying. She could hear them below, the conversation, the silver on the china, the brief swell of laughter that rose through the floorboards and then subsided. The sounds of a world she had been trained for and entered every morning as a teacher and was dismissed from every evening as an employee. The myth is that she was trusted. The reality is that she was tolerated. The myth is that she was part of the family. The reality is that she was part of the budget. And the budget, as we've already seen, listed her alongside the coal and the candles and the laundry soap. £40 a year, 15 shillings a week, and the weekly 15 shillings held in the palm as a single coin is remarkably small for what it purchased. It purchased a woman's education, her time, her patience, her silence, her compliance, her isolation, and her invisibility for 7 days out of every 7, in a house where she was present for every waking hour and belonged to none of them. 15 shillings. That is the coin. And what it bought, and what it cost, and what it did to the body of the woman who earned it, is the next part of this story. The coin bought 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a room that was cold at one end and tolerable at the other. Over time, the room left its mark. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The way weather marks a building slowly from the outside in, until the damage is structural and no longer possible to reverse. The governess's body aged faster than her years. This is not a figure of speech. It is a physical description recorded by contemporaries who observed the profession from outside, and by women who described it from within. The posture changed first. Years of sitting at a desk that was built for children, leaning forward to examine slates and exercise books, produced a stoop that became permanent. The shoulders rounded, the upper back curved. By her middle 30s, a governess who had entered the profession at 20 often carried herself like a woman a decade older, and the stoop was visible in the way she walked, in the way she stood at the blackboard, in the way she sat at her own desk in the evening, writing the lesson reports by the light of a candle held close, because the light from a single flame was not sufficient to illuminate the page from any distance. The eyes weakened. This was the second mark. The schoolroom's high windows admitted daylight from above, but the governess's desk was positioned at the side of the room, in the dimmer light, and the evenings were worse. She read and wrote, and marked, by candlelight, or by the flame of a small oil lamp, in a room where the only other source of illumination was the fire, if it was still burning. The strain accumulated. Headaches became chronic. The small print of the grammar book, which she had read without difficulty at 22, required her to hold it closer at 30, and closer still at 35. Spectacles, if she could afford them, came from her own salary. If she could not, she squinted, and the headaches worsened, and the marking took longer, and the evenings grew longer still. The cold left its own record. Chilblains on the fingers and toes, swollen and itching, a consequence of hours spent in insufficiently heated rooms, followed by brief exposure to warmth when the fire was finally lit. Rheumatic pain in the joints, particularly the hands and wrists which were in constant use, writing, marking, demonstrating, correcting posture at the piano. A persistent cough that appeared in November and did not fully clear until April, fed by the damp air of a room where wet wool dried slowly on a peg by the door after the afternoon walk, and by the chalk dust that hung in the air every morning and settled in the lungs over the course of years. The cumulative effect was not a single dramatic collapse. It was a long, slow diminishment, visible only to the woman who lived inside it and, occasionally, to a new employer who met her for the first time and thought she looked older than her stated age. The body that had entered the schoolroom at 20, upright and quick and capable of standing at a blackboard for 3 hours without discomfort, was not the same body that occupied the same schoolroom at 35. The stoop, the squint, the cough, the ache in the wrist that sharpened in cold weather, these were the profession's receipts, and the body kept them all. There was no provision for illness. This is the fact that turns the physical toll from an inconvenience into a trap. If the governess fell ill, she had 2 options. She could continue to work, teaching through the headache, the cough, the fever, the rheumatic pain, because the household expected her to be present, and the children's schedule did not pause for her discomfort. Or she could take to her bed, in which case the household's immediate response was not sympathy, but calculation. How long would she be unable to work? Could the mother manage the children in the interim? And if the illness persisted, the question became sharper. Should she be replaced? There was no sick leave. The term did not exist in the governess's vocabulary because the concept did not exist in her employment. She was not entitled to a day of paid rest. She was not guaranteed her position if she could not perform it. Her contract, such as it was, covered her presence and her teaching, and if she could provide neither, the contract, again such as it was, could be ended at any time. A governess who fell seriously ill in a household that was patient might be given a week. A household that was less patient or less wealthy or simply less inclined to wait might give her days. And a governess who was dismissed during an illness left the house with no income, no reference, and no one to care for her because the household she had lived in for years was not her family, and the obligation the family felt toward her was, in the end, contractual, not personal. She returned to the schoolroom. She always returned to the schoolroom, and the body continued to keep its ledger. The governess's work in life lasted, on average, between 15 and 20 years. She entered the profession in her early 20s, when her father's death or her family's financial collapse made it necessary. She left it in her late 30s or early 40s, when the accumulation of physical wear, the diminishing demand for older governesses, and the simple passage of time made it impossible to continue. The exit was not a retirement. There was no ceremony, no pension, no thank you letter from the profession she had served. The exit was a gradual closing of doors, household by household, as the woman who had once been young enough and strong enough to manage a schoolroom for 15 hours a day found that the household's advertising for a governess wanted someone younger, someone cheaper, someone whose posture had not yet curved, and whose eyes had not yet weakened, and whose cough did not echo down the corridor during the morning lesson. By 40, the governess's body told a story that no reference letter could disguise. Her hands were stained at the fingertips with iron gall ink, a discoloration that soap could lighten but not remove, accumulated over years of marking in red and writing reports in black. Her posture was set. Her complexion, never exposed to anything more than the afternoon walk's weather, was pale in a way that suggested not delicacy, but confinement. She looked, to a prospective employer meeting her for the first time, like a woman who had spent 20 years indoors, which is exactly what she was. After the governess years, the prospects were narrow. Marriage, which might have been possible at 22, was far less likely at 40. The social connections that could have led to marriage had been severed by years of seclusion. The men she might have met at parish gatherings, at dinner parties, at the social events of a normal life, she had never met because the normal life had not happened. The profession had consumed the years in which courtship was expected to occur, and it returned her to the world at an age when the world had moved on without her. Her professional skills, such as they were, had no market outside the household. She could teach French, but not at a school, because schools required qualifications she did not have. She could play the piano, but not professionally, because professional musicians trained differently and performed publicly, which she'd never done. She could manage children, but the families who hired governesses wanted young women, not experienced ones, because youth was cheaper and carried fewer signs of wear. The skills that had sustained her for 20 years were, in the labour market, worthless the moment she stepped outside the household that had employed her. She had been trained for nothing except the position she could no longer hold. Savings were nearly impossible. From a salary of £35 or £40 per year, the governess was expected to provide her own clothing. The dark wool dress that the household required had to be replaced annually, because wool that is worn every day for 15 hours, in chalk dust and rain and the residue of a coal fire, does not last longer than a year. Boots, gloves, bonnets, undergarments, all of these came from her salary. So did the notepaper for her letters. So did the postage. So did the small personal items that made the attic room bearable. A book, a comb, a mirror. When she left one position and moved to the next, the cost of travel came from her own pocket. The coach fare from one county to another, the cost of lodging if the journey required an overnight stop, the trunk that held everything she owned, carried by a porter she tipped from her diminishing reserves. Each transition between households cost money she could not afford to spend, and the transitions happened every 2 to 4 years, on average, because governesses rarely stayed longer, and the reasons for leaving were varied, and the cost of leaving was always hers. The arithmetic is simple and pitiless. £40 in. Clothing, travel, personal expenses and incidental costs out. The net savings in a good year might be £5. In a bad year, when a transition coincided with an illness or a delay between positions, the net savings were nothing, or less than nothing. Over a working life of 20 years, a governess who was fortunate, who was never ill, who was never dismissed without warning, who was never stranded between positions, might accumulate £60 or £70. £60 after 20 years of work. It is not enough to live on for more than 2 or 3 years, and it is not enough to invest at a rate that would generate a meaningful return. It is a sum that dwindles. That is its nature. It sits in a savings account or in a tin box in a rented room, and each month it is smaller, and each month the future it is supposed to support grows shorter. There was no pension. No employer contributed to a retirement fund. No professional body maintained an annuity for former members. The governess who could no longer work had whatever she had saved, and when the savings ran out she had nothing. The destinations of former governesses in old age were documented by charity workers and social commentators with a specificity that makes the records difficult to read. Some found lodging with a relative, a sister or a niece, who could absorb the cost of an additional person at the table, and who offered, in return for the governess's help with small domestic tasks, the first genuine companionship she'd experienced in decades. These were the fortunate ones, and they knew it. Some took rooms in boarding houses, living on a few shillings a week from their diminishing savings, in rooms that were smaller and colder than the attic bedrooms they had occupied in the households where they had worked. The boarding house room had one advantage over the attic. It was hers. She had chosen it. She could leave it when she wished, and nobody would ask where she was going or when she would return. But the advantage was mostly theoretical, because she had nowhere to go and no one to visit, and the neighbourhood outside the boarding house window was as unfamiliar to her as every other neighbourhood she had lived in without ever being introduced to. The room, for all its freedom, was as solitary as the schoolroom had been, and colder, because the boarding house fire was a shared fire in a shared parlour, and the parlour closed at 9, and after 9 the room had no heat at all. The savings dwindled, the rent was paid, the food was bought, and each month the tin box under the bed was lighter, and each month the arithmetic told the same story, which was that the money would not last, and that the question was not whether it would run out, but when. Some entered the workhouse. The workhouse was the final administrative category available to a person who had no income, no family, and no other recourse. It was not designed for gentlewomen. It was designed for the destitute, and its routines were industrial, and its food was institutional, and its dormitories were shared with women whose lives had followed entirely different paths. The former governess, who had taught French and geography and piano, who had modelled deportment and moral character, who had eaten from unmatched crockery in a room on the 3rd floor of a respectable house, now ate from tin plates in a room with 30 strangers. The distance between the two rooms was measured in years and in shillings, and both had run out. The Governesses Benevolent Institution was founded in 1843 in London by a group of concerned citizens who had recognised the scale of the problem. The GBI provided 2 forms of assistance. It offered temporary financial aid to governesses who were between positions and could not support themselves during the gap, and it offered small annuities to former governesses who had retired and had no other income, annuities of between £15 and £20 per year, enough to rent a small room and buy food and little else. The intention was generous. The execution was overwhelmed. The number of women who applied to the GBI for assistance vastly exceeded the institution's resources. The application process itself required the governess to document her destitution, to prove that she had no savings, no family support, no other recourse, and to submit to an assessment of her character and her working history. The process was, in effect, a formal acknowledgement that the profession had failed her, conducted in the administrative language of charity, which required her to demonstrate not her competence, but her helplessness. The GBI's annual reports make for particular reading. They list the number of applications received, the number of annuities granted, and the number of applicants who were turned away because the funds were not sufficient. The gap between the need and the provision was, in every year the institution operated, enormous. The reports were published. They were read by the same class of families that employed governesses, and the families continued to employ governesses at the same salaries, under the same conditions, with the same absence of pension or provision, because the system that produced the need was the same system that produced the demand, and neither side of the equation had any mechanism for changing the other. The annual report is a document. It has columns and figures and a tone of measured concern, and it is the closest thing the Victorian governess ever received to an official acknowledgement that the life she had lived and the profession she had served had been designed in a way that guaranteed her eventual ruin. The report is on the desk, the figures are in the columns, and the woman who appears in them, reduced to a line in a charitable ledger, is the same woman who spun the globe this morning and set out the chalk and waited for the fire. The GBI's reports were not the only documents that recorded her. She appeared in various forms and various languages across the written culture of the century, and each appearance told a slightly different version of her story. Some of those versions were accurate, some were not, and the distance between the two reveals something important about what Victorian society understood about the governess and what it preferred not to understand. She appeared in the newspapers first. The classified columns of the Times and of dozens of smaller regional papers carried the advertisements. They were formulaic and they were numerous, and they read with a flatness that made every woman sound the same. A lady of reduced circumstances seeks a situation as governess in a respectable family, competent in French, music, and the usual English branches, salary moderate, references furnished. The advertisements ran in columns, one after another, dozens in a single edition, identical in structure and nearly identical in language, and the cumulative effect was not of individual women seeking individual positions, but of a vast, undifferentiated labour market in which supply overwhelmed demand, and in which the language of gentility has been compressed into a format designed for rapid scanning by employers who had already decided what they were willing to pay. The woman who wrote the advertisement, or who paid a few pence to have it placed, reduced her entire education, her entire working history, and her entire character to 4 lines of type. She competed with every other woman on the same page, and the page was long. A prospective employer reading the classified section over breakfast could scan 30 advertisements in 5 minutes, and none of them would be distinguishable from the others, because the format did not allow for distinction. The governess was, in the language of the newspaper, a commodity, interchangeable, moderately priced, available immediately. The census recorded her differently. In the returns for 1851, and again in 1861 and 1871, the word governess appeared as an occupation, entered in the registrar's hand beside a woman's name and age and place of birth. No further detail was given. The census did not record her salary, or her working hours, or whether she ate alone, or whether her room had a fire. It recorded her as a category, a single word in a column, and the word was sufficient for the purposes of the state, which needed to know how many governesses there were, but had no mechanism for knowing what a governess was. The peak came at mid-century. The 1851 census recorded approximately 25,000 women employed as governesses in England and Wales. 25,000 women in 25,000 schoolrooms in 25,000 houses, each of them eating alone, each of them teaching 12 subjects, each of them writing lesson reports by candlelight in a room that smelled of chalk. It was the high water mark. The number would hold roughly steady through the 1860s and then begin slowly and then with gathering speed to fall. The fall, when it came, would not be caused by a change in the women themselves. It would be caused by a change in the world around them. The forces that would dismantle the profession were already in motion, while the GBI was still counting its applicants. The first was educational. In 1848, Queen's College was founded in Harley Street, London, with the explicit aim of improving the education of women who intended to become governesses or teachers. The college offered lectures in arithmetic, geography, grammar, Latin, and theology, and for the first time, a woman who wished to teach could sit an examination and receive a certificate that attested to her competence in specific subjects. The certificate changed the terms of the profession, though slowly. It did not, on its own, create a professional standard, but it introduced the idea that teaching required preparation, that competence could be assessed, and that a woman's claim to be able to teach French or geography could be verified by someone other than the employer who happened to be listening. Queen's College was small, its graduates were few, its impact in the first decade was limited to London and to the small number of women who could afford to attend. But the principle it established, that teaching was a skill that could be learned and certified, was the beginning of the end of the governess economy, because the governess economy depended entirely on the assumption that teaching was not a skill at all, but an extension of gentility. And once that assumption was questioned, the entire structure began very gradually to shift. The second force was legislative. In 1870, Parliament passed the Elementary Education Act, which for the first time made basic schooling available to all children in England and Wales. The Act did not immediately abolish the governess. It addressed a different class of children entirely, the working class, the children of labourers and factory hands and agricultural workers who had never employed a governess and never would. But the Act established a principle that was, in the long run, more destructive to the governess economy than any amount of charitable concern. The principle was that education was a public responsibility, not a private arrangement, that children had a right to be taught, and that the teaching should meet a standard, and that the standard should be set by the state, rather than by the individual household. Once that principle was established for the poor, the question arose, naturally and inevitably, whether it could also be extended to the middle class. And if schools existed for the middle class, the question that followed was equally inevitable. And it was the question that the governess could not survive. What then was the governess for? The answer came in the form of buildings. Girls' high schools began to appear in the 1870s and 1880s, brick buildings with proper classrooms and timetables, and qualified teachers who had attended training colleges and held certificates in the subjects they taught. The North London Collegiate School had been founded in 1850, but it was the proliferation of similar schools in the decades that followed, many of them established under the auspices of the Girls' Public Day School Trust, that provided the structural alternative to the governess that had never previously existed. The schools offered something the governess could not: multiple teachers, each specialising in a single subject, a curriculum designed by professionals, examinations that measured progress, and companionship for the pupils, which meant that education was no longer an isolating experience conducted in a room on the third floor of a private house, but a social one, conducted in a building designed for the purpose, among peers. The governess had no answer to this. She could not specialise because she was expected to teach everything. She could not offer examinations because she had no examining authority. She could not provide companionship because she was alone. The schools did not replace her overnight. The process took decades, but the direction was clear from the 1870s onward, and the census returns confirmed it. The number of governesses fell steadily through the last quarter of the century, and by 1900 the profession that had employed 25,000 women at mid-century was already a fraction of its former size. While the profession was dying in fact, it was thriving in fiction. This is one of the stranger features of the governess's history, and it is worth pausing on, because the fiction has done more to shape the popular memory than the reality ever could. Charlotte Brontës published Jane Eyre in 1847. Charlotte had worked as a governess herself in 2 households, and had found the experience miserable. Her sister Anne had worked as a governess in the Ingham family and then in the Robinson family, and had written her own novel, Agnes Grey, based on the experience. Emily, the third sister, had worked briefly as a teacher and had hated it. The Brontë household produced 3 women who entered the profession, and 3 women who used fiction to describe what the profession had done to them. Jane Eyre is the most famous governess in English literature, and the novel that carries her name is, by any measure, a masterpiece. It is also, by any honest reckoning, a fantasy. Jane is poor and plain and employed. These details are accurate. She is isolated and dependent and watched. These details are accurate too. She eats apart from the family. She occupies a room that is neither the master's quarters nor the servants'. She is observed constantly and valued conditionally. Charlotte knew these details because she had lived them, and the first 2/3 of the novel are as precise a description of the governess's daily reality as anything published in the period. But the novel resolves Jane's predicament with a romantic ending, a marriage to the employer, a fortune inherited from an unknown relative, a transformation from servant to mistress of the house, that no real governess could have expected and almost none experienced. The attic that contains the madwoman in the novel is, in the popular imagination, the defining image of the governess story. But the real attic, the one the real governess slept in, contained no madwoman and no mystery. It contained a bed, a wash basin, and a trunk. And the woman who slept in it did not marry the master. She moved to the next house, and the next attic, and the next schoolroom, until the houses stopped hiring her. The ending is satisfying because it is the ending the reader wants. It is also misleading, because it implies that the governess's problem is romantic, that her suffering is caused by the distance between herself and the man she loves, and that the solution is union with him. The real governess's problem was not romantic. It was structural, and the structure did not resolve itself with a proposal. It resolved itself with a boarding house, or a workhouse, or a line in the GBI's annual report. The governess novel became a genre. Sensation fiction in the 1860s and 70s used the figure of the governess repeatedly, but the version it presented was different from Brontës. In sensation novels, the governess was not a sympathetic heroine. She was a figure of anxiety and fascination, a woman who lived inside the household but was not of it, who had access to the children and to the family's private correspondence, and to the master's study, and to the rooms that guests never saw. She was educated enough to be dangerous and poor enough to be desperate. The sensation governess was a potential seducer, a potential thief, a potential madwoman, a woman who might at any moment reveal that the gentility she performed was a disguise, and the real woman underneath was something else entirely. She was the anxiety that the real governess generated, distilled into fiction, and consumed for entertainment by the same class of families that employed real governesses in their own homes. The irony is considerable. The families who read sensation novels about dangerous governesses at night were the same families who sent their children to a real governess every morning, and the distance between the fictional danger and the real woman marking exercise books upstairs was a distance that nobody in the household appeared to notice or wish to examine. The fiction survives. The profession does not. By 1900, the governess was in terminal decline, replaced by institutions that could do what she had done more cheaply, more systematically, and with professional qualifications that she had never been given the opportunity to earn. The classified columns of the Times still carried a few advertisements, but they were thinner now, and the tone had shifted. The language of reduced circumstances gave way to the language of qualification. Trained teacher seeks position. Certificate from Queen's College. The old formula, with its delicate implications of gentility and misfortune, was disappearing because the world that had produced it was disappearing too. By 1914, the outbreak of war accelerated a transformation that was already nearly complete. Women entered the workforce in roles that had nothing to do with the schoolroom. The social structures that had produced the governess economy, the genteel family fallen on hard times, the limited employment options for educated women, the assumption that teaching was a natural extension of femininity rather than a professional discipline, all of these were already weakening, and the war broke what was left of them. The schoolroom emptied, not all at once, not with a declaration or a decree. The rooms on the 3rd floor of the large houses were simply no longer used for the purpose they had been designed for. They became storage rooms, or nurseries without a governess, or spare bedrooms for guests who never thought to ask what the room had been before. The globe was left on its shelf, gathering dust, its brass stand tarnishing slowly in the unused air. The piano was moved to the drawing room, where it belonged to the family now, not the curriculum. The blackboard was taken down. The iron-framed desks were carried to the attic or sold. The slates were stacked in a cupboard and forgotten. The room that had contained a woman's entire working life for decades was absorbed back into the house, its walls repainted, its purpose erased, as though she had never been there at all. No one marked the moment. No one recorded the date on which the last governess left the last schoolroom for the last time. The profession ended the way it had been conducted, quietly, without ceremony, and without anyone thinking it necessary to note that something had disappeared. The window is still there. The high window that let in the light and kept out the view. The window that she sat beside for years without ever being able to see the street below. The window is the last physical trace of the governess in the architecture of the house, and it is the detail that connects everything that has come before to everything that comes after. The light falls through it in the same way. The room has changed, the woman is gone, but the window remembers the angle at which the morning light entered, and the shadow it cast across the desk where she sat, and the particular quality of illumination that made the centre of the room bright and the edges dim, and it remembers because windows do not forget. They simply go on admitting whatever comes through them, without preference and without opinion, long after the person who sat in their light has moved on. But the woman has not moved on. Not entirely. She has changed form. The schoolroom on the 3rd floor has been repurposed. The globe has been removed. The piano belongs to the drawing room now. The blackboard is gone, and the slates, and the chalk, and the iron-framed desks that were scaled for children and too small for the woman who sat among them. The room is a guest bedroom, or a study, or an office. The house no longer employs a governess, because the house no longer needs one, because the schools took over, and the schools have teachers with certificates and pensions and colleagues and lunch breaks, and the teacher goes home at 4 o'clock, and the house she goes home to is her own. But the structure that produced the governess has not disappeared. It has adapted. The woman who is paid to be present for every hour and compensated for none of them, who performs emotional and intellectual labour that is classified as something less than professional work, who is too qualified for one category and too precarious for another, that woman exists in every era. She changes her title, she changes her industry, she changes her century, she does not change her position. The modern economy has its own versions of the schoolroom on the 3rd floor. The 0 hours contract which guarantees a worker's availability to the employer, without guaranteeing the employer's commitment to the worker. The gig worker who is classified as self-employed but has no control over her schedule, and who provides her own equipment, and whose income is listed as a service fee rather than a wage, because the distinction between the two determines whether the employer owes her a pension, and the employer has decided that the answer is no. the care worker who is paid for the tasks she performs, the bath, the meal, the medication, but not for the hours she spends travelling between clients, or waiting for the next appointment, or sitting in her car in a car park because the gap between calls is too short to go home and too long to do nothing. The adjunct lecturer who teaches the same courses as a tenured professor, in the same building to the same students, for a fraction of the salary with no office, no health insurance, no retirement contribution, and no guarantee that the work will continue next term. She is, in the language of the university, a contingent worker. The governess was, in the language of the household, a necessary expense. The words are different. The position on the ledger is the same. The nanny who lives in the household and is told she is part of the family until the family no longer needs her, at which point she discovers that the family meant something different by the phrase than she did. The live-in care aide who sleeps in the spare room and is on call through the night and whose hours are not counted because she is present rather than working. And the distinction between presence and work is the same distinction that allowed the Victorian household to employ the governess for 15 hours a day and pay her for none of them individually. The governess's salary was budgeted alongside the coal. The gig worker's income is classified as a service fee. The care worker's travel time is classified as personal time. The adjunct's preparation hours are classified as professional development. The language has changed, the ledger has not. The profession's legacy is easier to see in what it left behind than in what it intended to produce. The governess did not create a system of professional teaching. She demonstrated by her failure why such a system was necessary. The institutions that replaced her, the training colleges, the high schools, the examining boards, the teaching unions, all of them were built in response to the problems that the governess economy had made visible. The untrained teacher, the unprotected worker, the woman whose competence was assumed rather than assessed, whose labour was purchased at the lowest possible price, and whose future was treated as somebody else's problem or nobody's problem at all. Queen's College existed because the governess had no qualifications. The Education Act existed because education had no standard. The Girls' Public Day School Trust existed because girls had no schools. Each of these institutions was, in its own way, an admission that the system the governess had served was broken, and each of them, by providing a better alternative, made the governess unnecessary. She was replaced by the very reforms that her suffering had made possible. The profession that destroyed her also, in the end, produced the conditions for its own abolition. The women who did not survive to see those reforms were numerous, and the records of what became of them are scattered and incomplete, but they exist. In the asylum admission registers of the 1840s and 50s, the word governess appears with a frequency that the historian Catherine Hughes has described as disproportionate to the profession's size. The asylums did not record why a former governess had been admitted, only that she had been, and the diagnosis, when one was given, was usually listed as exhaustion, or melancholia, or nervous collapse, language that described the symptoms without identifying the cause. The cause was the schoolroom. The cause was 20 years of solitary confinement conducted in plain sight, in houses full of people, without anyone noticing that the woman on the third floor was breaking. The asylum is the spiral return of the governess's story. It is the place where all the other details converge. The cold room, the poor light, the insufficient salary, the absent pension, the social isolation, the unmatched crockery, the tray that arrived 3 times a day and was collected without a word. Each of these details is, on its own, survivable. Taken together, over years, in a body that was aging faster than its calendar age, they produced a cumulative effect that the Victorian vocabulary called a nervous condition, and the modern vocabulary would recognise as chronic occupational stress compounded by social deprivation. The governess did not collapse because she was weak. She collapsed because the structure she occupied was designed to extract the maximum amount of labour from a person while providing the minimum amount of support, and the structure worked exactly as it was intended to work, for exactly as long as the person could bear it. There is no monument to the Victorian governess, no plaque on a building in Harley Street or Kensington or any of the quiet residential squares where she lived and worked. No statue in a park, no annual commemoration. The 25,000 women who occupied the schoolrooms of England at mid-century left behind no professional archive, no union records, no pension documents, no collective memory that can be consulted in a single location. They left behind individual letters, some of them collected by historians a century later, and published in volumes that are read by scholars and by almost no one else. They left behind the classified advertisements in the newspapers, preserved in library microfilm collections, where the same phrases repeat edition after edition, year after year. A lady of reduced circumstances, competent in French, salary moderate, until the repetition itself becomes the evidence. They left behind the annual reports of the GBE, which are preserved too, bound in volumes with dark covers and careful typography, each year's report listing the applications received, the annuities granted and the applications refused. And the ratio between the last two numbers is the ratio that tells the story more precisely than any single narrative could. And they left behind the novels, Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey, the sensation novels that turned the governess into a figure of danger and desire and domestic anxiety. The fiction outlived the profession by more than a century. The fiction is what most people know, and the fiction is, in almost every case, wrong about how the story ended. Jane Eyre married the master. Mary did not. It is 9 o'clock in the evening now, in the house in Kensington, and the children are in bed. Mary has been working since 6 this morning. 15 hours. She has taught reading and writing and arithmetic and history and geography and French. She has supervised piano practice. She has walked the children through the streets of the neighbourhood in the rain, in wool that is still damp and hanging on a peg by the schoolroom door. She has eaten 3 meals from a tray, at a desk, in a room that smells of chalk and iron gel ink and the last of the coal fire. The lesson report is half written. She's writing it now by the light of the tallow candle that has been burning since this morning, trimmed twice and now burning low, its flames small and orange and steady. The wick needs trimming again. She does not trim it. She is nearly finished. The pen moves across the page in the handwriting that the children recognise and the mother occasionally reads and the father has never seen. Progress in French. Satisfactory. Piano. Improvement noted in the left hand. Geography. The globe exercise was well received. The globe is still on its stand. It has not moved since this morning, when she spun it before the children arrived. Africa is still facing the room. The Atlantic is behind. From below, the house is quiet. The family's evening is ending. The drawing-room conversation has dwindled to a murmur, and the murmur is dwindling to silence. The servants are finishing in the kitchen. The last sounds of the day, a dish set down, a door closed gently, the creak of the staircase as someone climbs to bed, are the sounds that Mary has heard every night for 14 months, and that she heard in the house before this one and the house before that. The tray is still on her desk. The supper tray, the third of the day, cleared of its food but not yet collected. The crockery on it, the cup that matches nothing, the plate from neither set, will be taken down in the morning by the housemaid, who will carry it to the kitchen without speaking, and wash it, and return it to the cupboard from which it came, and bring it back up tomorrow with the breakfast. She finishes the report. She reads it once, silently, to check for errors. There are none. The handwriting is steady and even, the same handwriting she's produced every evening for the past 6 years, in 4 different schoolrooms for 4 different families, and the consistency of it is the one professional skill that nobody has ever remarked upon, because nobody reads the reports with enough attention to notice. She places the pen in the groove of the desk. She closes the exercise book. She stacks the marked slates for the morning. She straightens the globe on its stand so that it sits level. She gathers the chalk pieces that have broken during the day and places them in the tray, and the tray makes the same faint rattling sound it made this morning when she set it down in the half-dark before the children arrived. She blows out the candle, and the room goes dark except for the faint glow from the embers in the grate, an orange light that does not illuminate so much as remember the warmth that was here an hour ago. She stands. The stoop is there, in the way she rises, a curve in the upper back that was not there 3 years ago. Her wrist aches faintly where she's been writing. Her eyes are tired. She gathers her shawl, wraps it around her shoulders, and takes the small candle from the mantelpiece. She lights it from the embers, cupping the flame with her hand until it steadies, and crosses the schoolroom to the door. The stairs to the attic are narrow. She climbs them by the light of the candle, one hand on the banister, the other cupping the flame against the draught that lives in the stairwell. The house settles around her. The wood creaks in the way that old houses creak at night, a language of contraction and cooling that she has learned to read without thinking about it. The air grows colder with each step because heat rises only so far in a house this tall, and the attic is the last place the day's warmth reaches and the first place it leaves. She passes the second floor. The family's bedrooms are behind closed doors, and a faint line of light shows beneath one of them, where someone is still reading. She does not pause. She climbs the final flight, which is narrower than the others and steeper, and the candle throws her shadow against the wall, tall and thin, and the shadow moves with her, and the shadow is the only company she has on the stairs. The room is as she left it this morning. The bed, narrow and made, the chest of drawers with a wash-basin on top, the water in it cold, the trunk at the foot of the bed containing everything she owns, the small rug that does not reach the edges of the floor, the ceiling that slopes with the roof, low enough that she cannot stand fully upright near the walls. She sets the candle on the chest of drawers. She unpins her hair. The pins go into a small dish beside the wash-basin, one by one, and her hair comes down, and for the first time since 6 o'clock this morning nobody is watching. She washes her face. The water is cold. Her fingertips are still faintly stained with the iron gall ink from the evening's marking, a discoloration that will fade by tomorrow but never fully disappear, because tomorrow she will mark again, and the day after that, and the day after that. She gets into bed. The sheets are cold. They will warm eventually from the heat of her body, because there is no other source of warmth in the room. The candle on the chest of drawers is still burning, small and orange, and she watches it for a moment before she leans over and blows it out. The dark is complete. The house is quiet. Mary is 28 years old. She has 15 shillings a week. She has a room she did not choose, and a profession she did not choose, and a future she cannot yet see the shape of. She does not know what the census will record about her. She does not know what the GBI's annual report will say. She does not know about Queen's College, or the Education Act, or the girls' high schools that will, in time, make her unnecessary. She does not know that Charlotte Brontë is writing a novel about a woman very much like her, and that the novel will give that woman a happy ending that Mary will not receive. She knows that tomorrow at 6 she will rise and dress and pin her hair and descend the stairs to the schoolroom, and she will set out the slates and the chalk and the grammar book, and she will spin the globe once to check that it turns, and the tray will arrive, and the fire will come eventually, and the day will begin again. The Victorian governess was not mistreated. She was not abused. She was not the victim of a single villain, or a single policy, or a single moment of cruelty. She was the product of a system that needed her, and used her, and paid her as little as the market allowed, and housed her in the space between two worlds that had each decided she did not belong, and then, when the system no longer needed her, let her go without a pension, without a reference to the future, and without remembering that she had been there at all. She was paid to be invisible, and the payment worked. That is the story. I hope it finds you well wherever you are tonight. If the room you are in is warm, notice that. If there is someone near you, that is worth knowing. The candle is out in the schoolroom. The globe is still. The tray will come again in the morning, carried by a hand that does not speak, and set down on a desk that still smells of chalk. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one.